Ancient Greece is remembered for its influence in many areas that have left a lasting impact on Western civilization, from philosophy to art and politics. However, it is also interesting to explore social customs and the lesser-known aspects of their culture, especially their attitudes towards intimacy and interpersonal relationships in comparison to current norms. Ancient Greece had a very different conception of personal relationships and the expression of sexuality. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss any important content about the darker chapters of our history. Intimacy in ancient Greece. Intimate relationships in ancient Greece played a fundamental role in the culture and social structure of the time. While the Greeks valued the virtues of self-control and rationality, they also considered intimate relationships to be part of everyday life. This aspect of Greek culture was evident not only in their writings and customs but also in their art. For the Greeks, there was no specific word for what we today understand as homosexuality. Relationships between people of the same gender, especially among men, were not only accepted but were a common part of everyday life in many Greek cities, especially Athens. These relationships often had a pedagogical component, where an older man, typically a respected citizen, assumed the role of mentor and protector to a younger man. This relationship had nuances of power and hierarchy, with the older man being seen as the dominant figure, while the younger man played a subordinate role. Symbolism in intimate relationships in ancient Greece. Domination and submission in relationships were important in terms of status symbolism. It was believed that the dominant position in a relationship was more honorable, while the passive role could lead to mockery and criticism, especially if this latter role was assumed by an adult man rather than a young one. In Athens, citizens who took the passive role in relationships with other adult men were ridiculed, and there were specific terms used in a derogatory manner to refer to those who took this position. Masturbation and its perception in Greek society. Although ancient Greece was less conservative regarding intimacy, masturbation was not entirely free of taboo. The Greeks viewed this act ambiguously. It was often depicted in art, especially women engaging in the act of self-pleasure, but in society, it was often seen as a minor practice and an object of ridicule. Aristophanes, one of the most famous Greek playwrights, included mentions of this act in his works, always with a humorous and dismissive tone. For the Greeks, pleasure was meant to be experienced in the company of another person, and self-pleasure was often associated with slaves, who were considered to belong to the lowest social class. Pederasty in Greek culture. One of the practices that has generated the most debate among modern historians about ancient Greece is pederasty, a relationship where an adult man acted as mentor and companion to a young boy. This relationship was seen as an important connection for the social and educational development of the young man, who, as he grew, would take his place in the social hierarchy. Philosophers like Plato, in his work The Symposium, described these relationships as a pure form of love that went beyond the physical and focused on the exchange of knowledge and life experiences. Law and morality in ancient Greece. Despite the tolerance towards certain intimate practices, there were laws aimed at limiting excesses. In the mid-5th century BC, laws were introduced to punish promiscuity. Those involved in behaviors considered inappropriate were not allowed to hold public office. However, many historians believe these laws were more a formality than a strict practice, as in reality, customs did not always align with official regulations. Mythology and power relationships. Greek mythology is full of stories where gods, especially Zeus, had intimate relationships with mortal women, often through deceit or manipulation. These stories reflect the ideas of domination in relationships of the time and show how seduction, and in some cases coercion, was justified within the context of mythology. In fact, many myths also depict goddesses as subjects of aggression, suggesting a view of intimacy in which power and domination played an important role. Prostitution and its role in ancient Greece. Prostitution was a legal occupation in ancient Greece for both men and women. Athens had state-run brothels, and prostitutes played a role in the city's social life. There were various levels within this profession. Concubines and courtesans belonged to a higher category compared to the prostitutes in brothels. Courtesans, for example, were educated and often companions to intellectuals and leaders. On the other hand, men who engaged in prostitution generally served older clients, and due to their occupation, they were later prohibited from holding public office as they were considered vulnerable to corruption. Humor and sexuality in Greek theater. Greek theater reflected the customs and attitudes of society, and the works of Aristophanes are a clear example of how intimate topics were approached with humor. In his play Lysistrata, the women decide to go on a sexual strike as a form of protest to end the Peloponnesian War. This work, filled with obscene humor and references to intimacy, shows the role of sexuality in the theater of the time and in Greek society. Aristophanes even included as many as 106 terms to refer to the phallus and more than 90 to refer to female genitalia, using an abundant vocabulary of euphemisms and metaphors. Types of love in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, there were different words to describe types of love, reflecting their complex and diverse understanding of the subject. Aphrodite was the goddess of intimate love, while Eros represented physical passion. The word erotic comes from his name and captures the physical component of love. In addition to these, there were terms like ludus for playful and light-hearted love, agape for selfless and unconditional love, and pragma for a lasting love cultivated over time. These distinctions show that the Greeks clearly differentiated between various forms of affection and emotional connection. Symbols and representation of intimacy in art. Nudity and the representation of sexuality in art were common in Greece. The Greeks did not view nudity as something shameful but as a form of beauty and heroism, especially in their statues. For example, the Hermes statue by Praxiteles, which depicted a bust and phallus on a column, was a symbol of fertility and was often placed at crossroads and temples. The Symposium Festival and its excesses. The symposium, a social gathering of men where philosophical topics were discussed and excessive drinking took place, was a common practice in ancient Greece. At these events, courtesans and musicians entertained the guests and participated in intimate activities. Although Plato describes the symposium in a more formal manner in his work The Symposium, the reality was probably much more unruly. Attitudes towards intimacy and Greek culture. Ancient Greek culture is fascinating for its open approach to relationships and its representation in all aspects of life, from art to politics. Their view of intimacy was integrated into their way of life and was not subject to the same moral judgments that came with monotheistic religions. Greek society cultivated a more permissive and natural attitude towards sexuality, offering us a unique perspective on how life was lived in a civilization that valued both freedom and self-control. If you've made it this far, you've learned something new with our stories. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Together, we can discover and remember the truths that history often tries to hide.